Hello class, it's Professor Streeter. In this video, as promised, I'm going to model reading a chapter from Shafer-Landau, so in this case chapter 6, Natural Law Theory. And this is the first major normative ethical theory that we're considering. Next week, week 7, we'll look at John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism, which is a form of consequentialism. And so in chapters 9 and 10, Shafer-Landau considers arguments in defense of and also problems with a consequentialist approach to ethics, a consequentialist approach to the standards of right action. What explains the origin of morality, what explains the basic standards for distinguishing between right and wrong, and what explains the objectivity of those standards, why they apply to all of us and the authority that those standards have over us. So consequentialism, which we'll look at next week in week 7, is one way of answering those kinds of questions. But for this past week, we looked at natural law theory, which provides a different approach to those questions. So I thought we'd do a close reading of the text together, and then I'll link it to some passages from the Thomas Aquinas reading in the Ethical Life. He's an example of a natural law theorist that Shafer-Landau mentions and references in his text. So we'll move back and forth. What I have here is the digital text. I access this from Red Shelf, but perhaps some of you are reading the online text. This is what it looks like in Red Shelf. And this is the first page of chapter 6, where Shafer-Landau is introducing the theory of natural law and its attractions. What makes it an attractive view? What reasons do we have to accept it? Okay, and then toward the end of the chapter, he sort of raises some questions about it and raises some problems. But he begins by looking at the attractions of the theory. And so the chapter starts with a simple claim. You are an animal. This is an example of a philosopher reminding you of something that you already know. So why is he reminding you of something you already know? Well, we tend to overinflate our sense of what we are. We are not angels. We are not gods. We are not separate from the natural world. We are part of the natural world. We are part of the animal kingdom. And so if we're looking to understand the source and the origin of morality, perhaps we can look to our nature as animals as the kind of key to understanding the moral standards that govern our lives. Okay, so the idea is that, look, if we're trying to think about what makes for a good life in the animal kingdom, we look to whether that particular animal is fulfilling its nature. Right? So if we're talking about a racehorse, right, a good horse is one that is fast. If we're talking about a chameleon, right, a good chameleon is one that camouflages itself well. Why? Because those qualities belong to the nature of the racehorse or to the nature of the chameleon. Okay, so a life is going well for the chameleon if it fulfills its nature. In this case, camouflages itself well from predators. Okay, so these are sort of simple examples, but the assumption here is that things in nature, chameleons, horses, human beings, have a nature, right? And that so the idea is that things are going well when they are acting naturally, right, or in accordance with their nature, but things go badly when they are acting unnaturally or somehow violate their nature. Okay, so the suggestion is, well, if we can say this about horses and chameleons, maybe we can say it the same thing about human beings, right? And so again, that's the guiding thought in the next paragraph. What is the starting point of natural law theory? This sort of observation that we are animals and that we can assess the lives of other animals and as being good or bad, depending on whether they are fulfilling or violating their nature. So maybe we can assess the lives of human beings in the same way and move from this kind of question of whether they are fulfilling or violating their nature and sort of pivot from there to a claim, well, this is what constitutes the moral life for the human, right? A moral life for a human being is one in which they are fulfilling their nature, right? So we kind of move from claims about nature to claims about morality, right? That's the suggestion. Okay, so the question is whether this view ultimately makes sense, okay? whether, you know, identifying the moral law with the natural law ultimately makes sense, right? But if it does make sense, then we would have a standard, a moral standard, objective, universal, kind of authoritative standard. And this is in italics here. The kind of principle that natural law theory proposes is that actions are right just because they are natural and wrong just because they are unnatural. People are good or bad to the extent that they fulfill their true nature. The more they fulfill their true nature, the better they are. Because that's a kind of formulation of the basic principle that's supposed to guide us in determining whether an action is right or wrong. It's a general principle that's supposed to apply in all cases. And then, you know, the specific application of the principle, right, will raise difficulties. But the question is, like, is that the general principle that we are operating with when we're talking about morality? Is that what we mean when we talk about morality? And does that explain the source, the origin, right, and the objectivity of our moral standards? Is that the best way to explain that? Okay, the natural law theorist wants to say yes. Okay, well, so right away there are some attractive parts of the theory that Shafer-Landau points out or reminds us of very, very early in chapter 6. So first of all, right, one reason to think that natural law theory is a good theory is that it solves some problems in ethics that many philosophers have grappled with. For example, how morality can be objective, how moral standards can depend on anything over and above human opinion or human preference. Right? Well, human nature is something that can be studied scientifically. It's something it has when we talk about a thing having the nature of a human being, we're saying something objective, right? It's not what makes something a human being can be defined objectively. It's not defined in relation to people's attitudes and beliefs and desires, right? So just because I want to be a human being doesn't mean I am a human being, right? Right. So when we talk about human nature, we're talking about something that is measurable, that is objective. And so if that's the source of morality, then that would make morality objective, right? Again, the idea that we do right when our acts express human nature, right? That's the measure of the rightness of an action, not like not something to do with human opinion, right, or human attitudes or human preferences, right? So in that sense, natural law theory provides an answer to the subjectivist or an answer to the relativist. Okay, there is an objective difference between right and wrong. It's based on objective claims about our nature. So Aquinas, he points to as an example of someone who connects views about human nature to views about God. Right? What constitutes our nature as human beings? Well, we were created by God and given a certain nature by God. So that's something that Thomas Aquinas believes. But you might think that your nature is determined by something else, right? You might think that you have the nature that you have independently of God or independently of God's will, right? So, but the theory is that whatever the origin of your nature, it is your nature as a human being that explains the origin of moral standards. Okay, and so that's a promising aspect of the view. It gives us a clear explanation of the objectivity of morality. It also explains why morality is especially suited for human beings, because unlike the other animals, human beings have more sophisticated reasoning abilities. So what distinguishes our nature as human beings is that we're rational, that we make decisions on the basis of reasons, right? We can assess different types of choices, different ways of living. We can analyze actions and policies, and we can give ourselves laws or give ourselves principles that govern our behavior. We're not just creatures of instinct. Right, so this capacity for rational thought, as he says, seems to be the cornerstone of morality. It's what makes us agents. It's what makes it the case that we bear responsibility for our actions, that we're worthy of praise and blame. Right? Since I did something for a reason, then I can be held responsible for what I did. I deserve praise for what I did or blame for what I do. And so this is something that distinguishes us from the other animals. Right? We don't hold the chameleon responsible, right? Because we don't think that the chameleon is acting for a reason or is controls its behavior through reasoning. Its behavior is determined for it by instincts. But we are rational beings, is the thought. so we are partly responsible for what we do. And so again, natural law theory has a way of explaining why morality applies only to the human being and not to all other animals. We are animals, but we are distinctive animals in that we are rational. Okay, and then third, natural law theory seems to explain clearly where morality comes from. It comes from us. Now, if you think that we came from God, then ultimately morality comes from God. But you can separate that. Right? Morality begins with the origin of human nature. Before human beings, there was no morality. Right? Before the power to reason and act according to reasons. Right? Before the capacity to bear responsibility for one's actions. Right? By controlling your behavior through reasoning. Right? And that the thought is that nature came into the world with humans. Right? And so, and that's at that moment, right, morality emerged as well, right? Standards governing our decisions, right? Reasons for holding some people responsible for some actions and not others. Reasons for praising and blaming people, right? That's where morality began, right? Okay. And then finally, natural law theory seems to give a fairly straightforward and plausible explanation as to how we know the difference between right and wrong, how we gain moral knowledge. Right? If you want to know the difference between right and wrong, you just have to study human nature. You have to know what our nature is, right? Our biological nature, our psychological nature, our emotional nature, our rational nature, right? So if you know, and those are things that we can know. So once we know what we are, then we know what it means for us, for our lives to go well, and then we know how to assess from whether we've done the right thing or the wrong thing. Right? If we have acted in accordance with our nature, we've acted right. Our lives are going better, and if we are violating our nature in some way, then we've done something wrong, and our lives are going worse. Right? So again, natural law theory seems to give us a clear way of explaining how we gain moral knowledge. Okay, so that's the first page, just giving a close reading. And so he's setting it up because he begins by pointing out that there are many attractive things about the theory. Like if natural law theory, if we can make sense of it as a way of explaining our moral standards, then that would be great because it would solve all these problems that we have, like how we gain moral knowledge, right? What the origin of morality is, where it came from, and then why it's specially suited for us as opposed to other kinds of beings in the world, and what makes it objective, right? So natural law theory can explain all these things well, but the question is it a theory we should accept, right? And so in the next page, starting with the section called Three Conceptions of Human Nature, Shafer-Landau begins to point out that the whole theory depends on a clear concept of what we mean by nature and human nature. And if we can't define that clearly, then the whole theory breaks down. Obviously, like if we can't say what human nature is in a satisfactory way and link it to standards of right and wrong in a clear way, then the theory doesn't go anywhere. So, okay, so on this page, he begins to look at three different conceptions of human nature and asks sort of whether they can do the work of explaining the origin of our moral standards. Okay, so that's what we'll talk about in the next video.